Hello, welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. Hello, welcome to hello, welcome to. There's something wrong with there with the. Okay, seems like it's got it right. Okay, hello, welcome to the realm of ideas is free to all. This is episode 27, Entanglement and Conditioning. This is a series of ruminations that I do once a week. Basically, kind of like going over ideas that have kind of like been with me throughout the time in my investigations into architecture. I'm Bruce Gemmel. I'm an architectural researcher and draftsman. And basically, these are the kind of like, this is actually new territory. I had started a series of discussions or kind of ruminations about a project. That project didn't manifest and that platform collapsed. So I basically redid them. And what I did was I didn't I'd lost all the pieces. So what I did was I went back and redid the entire series. And the original series had 26 components. So this is actually the first new one. So what was interesting in the course of going through the list, I found that it was just a decision to kind of follow the original cast and then see, if there was anything else to add. So I found that for the most part, there were some things that really did get expanded on, other things that kind of stayed the same. But anyway, what was interesting was I found that there were times when I wanted to kind of deviate from the list, but I kind of felt that it was better just to get these things back and resettle them. Okay. So now what we're doing is this is number 27. So this is the first new one. I have charted out to 32, and then I'll probably in the next couple of weeks probably chart out past that. But anyway, what we started was, and we'll kind of revisit some of these things today, was the idea of what I call the metaphor as an operation. Now, what I mean by that is we often think about the metaphor, and this was the first pieces that I did. I talked about the metaphor as a natural circumstance. I talked about it as an artistic thing, and I also talked about it as a social consequence in terms of what I call unbreakable bonds. Those were the first three. And then from there, we went on to some other things in terms of kind of charting through the different kind of circumstances in architecture. I talked about unbreakable bonds. I talked about the value and necessity of criticism, the art of drawing, criticism, drawing, architecture as a verb. Now I actually come to see architecture as a process or kind of series of processes. And then I talked about my desire for an organic architecture. So today, after going through some other things, I'm going back to this idea of the organic component of my investigations. Since the truly organic architecture is an ambitious project and it's been something that people worked on for a long time, I think it's a very difficult thing given the kind of circumstances that architects have kind of put themselves in. And I think there's a long road from where we are, not just technologically, but I think psychologically in terms of getting to an organic architecture. And I'll kind of maybe talk about some of those concerns in upcoming weeks. But anyway, my work is split into two pieces. One that kind of has a kind of romantic and sentimental, kind of like more romantic than sentimental, which I'll talk about next week, which is what I call measurements. And this one that I'm talking about today, which is the more kind of forward thinking, is the organic component, which is what I call entanglements and conditioning. So anyway, before we go too much further, let me just kind of give another, let's do what we have been doing the last several weeks, and I think has been very, very good, which is this week in Julie. So based on the last few weeks, we've been doing these things, and now we're going to basically kind of make it a regular feature. Now, Julie is not going to stay with us for the whole time, or she might not, because she's finishing a painting, and she wants to basically kind of focus on that. So she may kind of chirp in from the side, but she's not going to be in the screen. So Julie, based on our conversations of entanglements and conditioning and some of the things we've been talking about, let us talk about what's new in Julie.
Okay, give me half sec, and you can introduce this drawing, if you will.
Okay.
How about that?
Okay, so this is an actual interest. This is an interesting drawing because what I find is that the complexity and intricacy of components and elements that Julie works for, that crafts together the different kind of like analogies and metaphors.
Do you want a backing or do you just want
I
to
don't
hold
think
it
so.
there?
See if I can kind of get this to be not glary.
It's very dark and there's a lot of graphite and
Yes.
colored pencil. So you let me know if you want
Okay,
something
so
on the back or if it's okay.
okay. For some reason it's kind of glary. If I put it straight, it's glary.
I'd say put it at a slight angle. That's how I have to
Okay.
photograph it usually.
Okay.
At a slight angle.
All right. So
And if you
what
go
Julie
into a
has
close
done
shot-
is based on an article that she found in Science about a bone collector caterpillar. This is an interesting character in the fact that it basically kind of has, we believe, this kind of like it has some kind of symbiotic relationship with a certain spider in that it shares its web. Now, what happens is the bone collector caterpillar has come in, and we're not sure if this is a commensalism, mutualism. We don't believe it's a parasitism. We've kind of put together a series of notes. We're going to reach out to the authors of the paper in Science. But anyway,
yeah, we should write that email.
what Julie has done is taken a lacquer box,
A writing box,
and used it as a kind of useful analogy of the actual spider web, in the fact that this particular spider doesn't go for open webs, but finds them in these cavernous, kind of dark spaces, which kind of gives the sense of this allured kind of black lacquer box. Now, also what I think is a really beautiful piece is that the vanitas component of the fact that the most precious, delicate lacquer box has, in this case, kind of been made vulnerable and inhabited by this caterpillar, which also shares its life with the spider. Now, what's also interesting about this particular caterpillar, and Julie and I were talking about the possibilities of this in terms of what could be the mutualism or the commensalism or the parasitism, is the fact that it creates an exoskeleton by taking the remnants of the prey from the spider. And we think that the potential is it could become a lure. It could become an active component of the pieces, so it could be recognized by the things that actually are preyed upon by the spider. Now, this is also not a vegetarian spider. This is basically a meat-eating spider and shares the meals. I mean, this caterpillar is a meat-eating caterpillar and actually shares the meals with the spider. So the spider and the caterpillar coexist. But tell us, Julie, about the story of this piece.
Well,
which is not really, it's too bad. It's such a beautiful drawing. It photographs really well, but I'm having a really hard time getting it to look in any way.
If you go really close, it does show up pretty well. If you
okay, so anyway,
super close,
I have to find out how to make this,
how to just put it up there
so it's kind of as a flat image.
I will.
Yeah, somebody does know. So anyway, tell us.
So when I came across this research article in Science about a month or so ago, you couldn't even see the actual body, the actual soft body of the caterpillar. In fact, it's nowhere in any of the photographed examples. What you have is a peripatetic exoskeleton that this caterpillar literally architects and engineers, and it goes way beyond what the decorator crab does, which is very, very similar. The decorator crab, for those of you unfamiliar with, oh, great,
it's such an extreme angle.
The behavior of the crustacean is, because the decorator crab moves along the bottom of the ocean in such a slow and methodical fashion, and it is succulent, and everything loves crab, including humans.
I love crab.
In a California roll. Yes. Anyway,
real crab.
Yes,
not
real
fake
crab. Yes, made with actual crab, not crab stick. But they affix anything that they find to their shell, and they make really. You sure you don't want like a hard back? And they make quite a sculptural.
Let me put that. Yeah.
They basically are the mimics of their environment. They attach barnacles and seaweeds and shells and all sorts of things where if they are not moving, they're really hard to spot. What's interesting and very divergent and different about this caterpillar that seems to be found on one place in Hawaii, it's incredibly rare. The population is minuscule and it's practically extinct, according to the Science Research article, which is they are carnivorous, as Bruce mentioned, and that is a real anomaly. People may not know this, but there are literally 2 or 3 types of caterpillars in the world that are meat eaters. And most of them just munch on leaves, and they chomp leaves, and they can actually wreck a crop. I mean, they're pretty voracious, but they are vegans. I mean, they don't eat meat. These do. And in fact, they will actively hunt and stalk meat and much larger prey, actually. So there really are more apex predators, but the spider would surely eat them, but it does not. And it seeks out spider webs, not flat, plain type webs in sunshine, but the bowl type webs that spiders make in the hollows of trees and the hollows of rocks, old wood. I mean, in between plants, places that are shadowed and dark and clandestine. So it does like to hide in the shadows, and it not only eats the leavings, all the meat and high protein leavings of the spider, but it builds with the severed appendages, the decapitated heads. And in my drawing, this is a decapitated head of an ant, and heads of weevils are on their bodies, legs of beetles, wings of flies. They are just basically, but they don't just affix them, they fashion them, they shape them, they mold them. They will shave it down. They will actually, the caterpillars will measure these severed body parts, and they are building a particular type of structure. So this is a single dwelling house that moves on their bodies, and these are placed in such a way, they are spun into their silk to make a really impermeable, spiky, dangerous looking exoskeleton that is, to say the very least, macabre. I mean, it is truly Edgar Allan Poe-esque. And if you were to narrate the life of a bone collector caterpillar, I nominate Vincent Price, who would have the perfect voice and the perfect personality. So what I've done was, this is not just one Japanese Edo period writing box. This is my Frankenstein, very fitting for the bone collector caterpillar invention. So I created a trompe l'oeil writing box, which is the dimensions and the size of this 9 by 12 inch page in my Strathmore drawing paper. So the box literally is the gold exterior. The compartments are the maquillé. For those of you unfamiliar, it's gold sprinkled in the lacquer, and to incredible depths, and the lacquer is put on in 30 or 40 different layers. And I created a top, which does not exist anywhere, with a spider web, using as my reference actual photos of spider webs in early morning covered with dew. So that top is something I designed and made and drew. And and what is still left to do in the center compartment, they all had an inkwell. I mean, they were writing boxes, and the cover of the inkwell is a fan shape in 2 of the boxes, but I'm morphing it into the adult moth of the bone collector caterpillar. On the left, it turns back into a fan. On the right side, oh, may I have a sip? I'm really tired. And there is actually a spider, a gold spider on one of the fans. So would
Yeah.
you like to comment based on our
Yeah, I think that
conversation?
one of the things I love is the fact that, like I said earlier, the vanitas is one of my favorite genres of painting all time. And I think the thing I loved about it was that at the same time where these pieces were incredibly precious, either between what's wrong?
Oh, I'm just being more on the screen. I was half cut off.
Okay. Well, come over more.
It's okay. I don't want to cut you. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Was that these things that were incredibly precious when you saw the exotic fruits that were brought from other lands, and these exotic beautiful objects, and they usually had, like, clarets and kind of like Wanli bowls and all kinds of these exotic pieces. But at the same time, they showed them how quickly they fell into vulnerability in terms of the fact that they became infested and they became kind of like vulnerable. And there's a beautiful painting at the Met that we don't see right now because it's not up, because they kind of like mismanaged a few of their pieces, especially the still lifes.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, there's one that's a kind of like trophy piece where it says it's imaginary landscape where there's a mountain, and it comes down to these series of canals, and the canals of the streets, unlike Venice, where it's actually a city with canals for roads. This is actually more a series of exotic houses and cottages that basically are connected by canals. So it's more of an agrarian kind of circumstance. It's more of kind of like but you see this sense of, at dark, the landscape changes, and this beautiful cultivated kind of landscape now becomes inhabited with wolves and coyotes and those kind of things that kind of come along that kind of take over the nighttime. So the vanitas is something where you'll see, I mean, for people not familiar with it, basically it's a kind of like usually a scene where there's opulent kind of like fruits and vegetables and meats and things of exotic character, things that are incredibly wealthy and exotic. And now they kind of like at the end of a feast, they're left, and before they're cleared, you can see the broken pieces, the kind of spent pieces. Sometimes there's actually broken objects, but you'll see, insects start to kind of take on. So in this case, with Julie's piece, I love the fact that the spider web is a really great analogy, because the cavernous aspects of the writing box, the Edo period writing box, now become that exotic piece that itself can become vulnerable, and it becomes inhabited by this spirited organism, which now coexists with the spider. Now the spider is completely invisible here, and that's actually partially because we don't really know which spider it is, and that's kind of part of our questions to the authors, is like, what is the genus of the spider? We would want to kind of see some kind of comparison. So in this case, because we were so taken, or Julie was so taken by the bone collector caterpillar, that became the focus. But in this case, just as if it exists on the fringes of the spider web, it exists in the cavernous recesses of the space between the top of the writing box and the writing box itself. But it kind of exposes the vulnerability of this precious object with the willful aspect of organism. That would be kind of like my
try to hold it back
assessment.
Up again.
Yeah, see if you can. Let me see.
Let me see if you can. The top got.
That's better.
That's pretty good.
That's not a bad angle.
The top got a little crunched in my.
Oh, sorry, Pete.
That's okay.
So, usually, like I said, Julie, and there's an interesting contrast between this and Julie's current painting. This is a drawing, but there's a real contrast in the fact that usually the elements that are used to kind of create the various different analogies and metaphors are quite many and complex, and that painting is kind of certainly testament to that approach, whereas this is much more conceptually simple. And I think the thing that I noticed initially in terms of the expression is that Julie's paintings have this very haunting, disarming quality where you get a sense of something being something beautiful. Now, this drawing is also quite beautiful, but beauty in a kind of serene, even placid, sometimes peaceful sense on the surface. But then as you start to go deeper and deeper, you start to see the terrifying nature of the consequence. And I think this one is much more immediate in the fact that the menacing aspect of this decapitated head used as a mask, almost as if, we've seen some of those cases where a kind of like serial killer will actually take the skin of his victims and kind of wear it as a kind of a trophy or as a mask or as a kind of some way to kind of inhabit that. So in a way, that kind of gothic macabre nature of kind of taking on the elements of these, kind
of its victims,
as its own entity. I mean, it's funny. We talked about that in terms of one of those kind of unbreakable bonds of the social metaphor between, kind of technology, and how technology was linked to superstition and mythology and religion, as opposed to now when it's linked to science, and how people used to take the character or the consequence of their victims as part of the possession of their conquest, which here kind of seems very much in play, So I find this quite haunting, quite disturbing, quite beautiful.
Thank you. I just came up with a really interesting question about all this. What happens to these cases that these bone collector caterpillars have architected when they morph? What happens to them?
Oh, what happened? I guess
what happens afterwards?
Very much like a cicada. It just leaves the exoskeleton behind, crawls out of it, and kind of like.
Yeah, but what becomes of it? Meaning, this is a very elaborate construct, and while it leaves, the spider remains. The spider doesn't leave with the caterpillar. The caterpillar is living in the spider's house.
Right.
And that house stays there. The spider stays there. What does the spider do? And I'll bet the spider does something with
That's a good
these
question.
cases.
It's a good question for the researchers,
isn't it?
Because the reality is, I mean, when the most exoskeletons or kind of most molting creatures, those sometimes the particular organism will digest, and will ingest and then digest itself. It's kind of molted.
But these would be impossible to.
Oh no, I know. But again, there's nothing coming behind it. See, the thing is, when the moth flies away, it never inhabits this space anymore. But I mean, the cicada usually leaves its exoskeleton attached to the tree.
Oh yeah,
when it leaves.
And they're found and they stay there.
I mean, the chrysalis usually remains, but the chrysalis is then kind of usually eaten by other forms of life.
Because it's able to
exactly.
Be eaten,
so the thing is,
all the substance that can be eaten or digested.
To us, we see the resemblance of the creature that has now moved on. So it's only a mask. It's no longer the creature. It's just the impression of the creature. But it's actually for the insect world or whatever, it's food.
Wait, I just had a really cool thought.
Cool.
Okay. What if the existence of bone collector caterpillars has created a race of spider collectors, arachnids who collect these exoskeletons in their house? I mean, it would be as if I came over to your house for high tea. And I created my own exoskeleton out of teacups and sugars and creamers and the petit four plates and various things, not organic or digestible. These chitinous parts are analogous to the porcelains. Who on earth is that? Anyway, so.
Oh, Alhu just said very beautiful.
Oh, that's great. Oh, we have a friend who's clearly up late. Oh,
she's in Turkey.
Oh,
so it's probably morning there.
Oh, great. So think about this. They coexist, and there is now a commensalism. And what if the benefit comes later? What if there's a partial benefit to having a succulent lure, which the caterpillar is,
Mm-hmm.
by its scent, by its wriggling presence, to attract, as we said, a huge number of species for the spider to eat, far, far more than would just happen to be caught in the web.
Mm-hmm.
But what if the greater benefit is this construct that the caterpillar makes that the spider doesn't make? The spiders don't do this,
But then uses. I don't see why not.
Now,
Could still have the same lure potential because it resembles. Now, again, we see this particular organism as a result of this construct that exists in terms of this creation of this exoskeleton. It could have a potential, just like if it's inhabited or not, to still have the potential to be a lure.
Wait, what if the spider uses it to lay and protect its eggs? Think about it. It's a great shielded, chitinous, hard repository of hollow vessels, heads, tubes, and chambers. What better than a hatchery that is fully protected, that birds could never get in here to eat this,
and just like what we were talking about, the fact that moths and birds and other things will often and other things will kind of use to identify mimicry, or kind of like deception, to kind of look like something that it's not when it sits upon a leaf or a petal or a flower or something like that. So I think that we have a series of questions. I hope that the researchers are able to kind of give us some.
Yeah, we should write that
benefit.
email.
Yeah, we should.
Because now we have a lot more questions.
We do. I think this was a good incubator to kind of start to kind of put together what some of those questions might actually be.
I have one more idea. I'm going to compare it to the bowerbird, one of my favorite architect builders in the animal world, next to the termites, of course, and the honeybees. But the bowerbirds use it to attract mates, and spider is also going to want to attract a mate. So what it shows is the spider that can have the most impressive commensal, that builds the best house, is going to get the best mate.
Right.
And animals do that all the time.
Which because I mean, the thing is, we're trying to find out what that mutualism is.
Yeah.
And we kind of see the fact that, at least
beneficial.
Initially, from what you see on the surface, you realize that the caterpillar gets food, gets shelter,
it's like a fishing
it gets
pole
safety,
with a worm.
But we're thinking like the fact that the spider doesn't attack the caterpillar
and it doesn't
coexist with it, and also must coexist with it when it's still naked before it's built the exoskeleton, means even though it's vulnerable at that moment, and the spider does not take it on, because
in fact never eats it in all their experiments.
Right. And also the thing is, this particular caterpillar is capable of living on the web without getting entangled. It's an incredibly intricate, complex relationship.
But I mean, what is the best thing that most of these animals do? Attract the best mate and show they are the most powerful, the most beautiful, the most intelligent. I mean, this would certainly be a towering achievement.
It is. Yeah, and it's like that kind of plays back into the fact that what I was talking about, this idea, which is really good with, in terms of understanding this idea of entanglement and conditioning. Now, what I mean by entanglement goes back to the original speaking about the operation of the metaphor. What I believe is the case, and there are certain people who kind of believe similar in both biological and kind of philosophical worlds, is that there is in fact an organic operation, that in terms of a sense of moving from a simple to a more complex, which seems counterintuitive. That, because we think of entropy, we think of things coming apart, going back to basics, but in fact we see the accretion of complexity. So we see this, I've used the word entanglement, as things move from simplicity to complexity.
Mhm.
There's a beautiful video in the original Cosmos, which,
Oh,
again, I'm not
I
going to
love
say
it.
that Neil deGrasse Tyson, who we've met and is a good guy,
Yeah, he's a
is
really
is
nice
terrible,
man.
did a terrible job. I think that his Cosmos was certainly inspiring, but I don't believe anything would ever top the
The
original Carl
original
Sagan.
Carl
But
Sagan.
Carl
No, I
Sagan
don't
has
even
has a brief sequence. It's about a
Mhm.
minute and a half where he shows a series of line drawings taking you through simple microorganisms all the way up to humans.
Oh, it's a
And it
brilliant
illustrates
series.
in very simple
Yeah,
terms
it's really
that
effective.
idea of intricacy from simplicity.
Mhm.
And you can, I talked about this in the first rumination. I talked about the fact that we start with energies, then they become
Mhm.
particles, particles become elements, elements become compounds, compounds become different things. And then before you know it, we kind of deal with the fact that then from carbon we have polypeptide chains, we have amino acids, then we have kind
Mhm.
of basically, little motors of life, and then things get intricate. And then we kind of see these things, and we kind of talked about this recently in terms of the kind of ideas that we even see that accretion towards civilization, which we talked about with Whitehead in Adventures and Ideas. But anyway, so based on the work, I feel as if there's two aspects to an organic architecture. Like I said, there's a tremendous amount of complexity. One is the idea of coming towards what I would call pursuit of organic ontologies as organisms. And this kind of follows up on a series of lectures that I'm kind of watching by a researcher named John Dupree.
Mhm.
And I feel as if it kind of has concept of a potential organic architecture. And like I said, this organic architecture has two components that I think are very daunting.
Mhm.
One is the technical component, but the other is the psychological component
Mhm.
of what does an organic architecture look like in terms of how we dwell.
Mhm.
And that, I think, is another part that I'm going to have to start talking about coming
Sure.
up. But anyway,
I may go work
okay,
on my
are we off?
paper. Yeah.
KP, bye,
Thanks for
loved one.
having me. I appreciate you.
Mm-hmm. You're the best one.
Thanks, P.
Bye, P.
Bye,
Okay.
P.
Okay. So don't let this
Yeah.
get
See how it
injured.
kind of got
I
kind of
saw that
little.
got
I don't
scuffed.
know how
I'll hold it while you get up.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, maybe let's move it. So, yeah, I'll move my chair back, and then I'll take it. Yeah, it kind of gets a little bit in the pad. It's tricky.
Well, I think you need to empty that pad because there's a lot of drawings in there.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Thank you.
so also what's interesting is that Lynn Margulis was actually married to Carl Sagan. I think they met. She was at the University of Chicago. I think they met at the University of Chicago. Anyway, she interestingly ended up at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and was a professor there for a long time. She was never really appreciated or recognized for the contributions that she made. I think a lot of advancements in evolutionary biology owe a great debt to her. Though she did not originate symbiogenesis, she does kind of like manifested in a way that was much more broad and appreciable within the kind of like contemporary context. But anyway, what it is, instead of like kind of like it's instead of seeing a kind of like a tree of life, and this is kind of more kind of like in terms of like the kind of microorganisms, we see things that are more of a series of networks of organisms rather than simply what we see as kind of branches on a tree. And I think it comes from a kind of certain necessity. And I think in terms of what I would call a conditioning, with which, as Whitehead would say, there's a kind of uh, intuitiveness or potential. So in the work that I would call my organic projects, I would say that in that case, I'm trying to do what I would call organic components or organisms. So that take these analogies that I would say as a series of kind of like organic pieces that can become entangled, and then understand how that entanglement creates a condition. And that condition is a potential for another kind of piece that kind of grows out of it. So in a way, it resembles that natural process. Now, again, I'm making these things with artificial materials, mostly with paper and string and simple things. But these things themselves are chosen specifically because they're recognizable in terms of other things. I mean, when we look at uh, basic components in nature, we see strings, we see strips, we see kind of like modules, we see things that kind of nest within other things. So what I've tried to do is kind of make my vocabulary kind of something that kind of recognizes these types of things as kind of useful components for kind of connection. But I think the main thing is the fact that this um, is an integration of processes, not a collection of parts. In my other work that I'll talk about next week, which is basically the idea of measurements, those are that's the attempt to create mechanisms for understanding and appreciating things that exist that we can understand in our conscious mind and our unconscious human aspect. Whereas these pieces that are more interesting to me are these ideas of kind of actually crafting a kind of proto or kind of meta organic circumstance. And it comes with those two basic pieces, which I think is that idea of trying to find that network of processes that can kind of entangle such that it can kind of like uh, generate new pieces. So that's kind of the piece that I do, is when I kind of put these things together and kind of create what I hope would be a provocative circumstance, it could lend itself towards that kind of creation. So, like I said, in the Cosmos film, Carl Sagan does a brilliant job by doing this kind of short piece, and it's something you can find on YouTube. It's kind of like the kind of like generation of life. I'm not sure which particular one it's from, but I have it on my YouTube page because I just love it, and I watch it from time to time, and it shows how things move from their different pieces, and I think using line drawing is an actual very useful operation, because you see how the string with the hook at the end creates an opportunity to create something that the string wasn't capable of doing. And just that little hook, or there's that little fold, the idea that these things create these opportunities for themselves. We think about mutation, but mutation is not so much really as haphazard as we kind of like have been led to believe. I think one of the things that's great about symbiogenesis uh, is that you come across this idea that you can actually look and enlist those components that you might be looking for, in the fact that you see in that kind of imagination of the organism. Now, again, one of the things that's interesting is, as I've come up through, my life of 66 years, I came from a time when we were very much enamored of the machine and of the mechanism. And we saw humans as the pinnacle of life. And we saw that this very kind of hermetic, anthropocentric, kind of isolationist reality was something where, the idea of artificial selection was something that we almost assumed was exclusively a human component, and didn't understand that, in fact, many organisms did that as well. In fact, it was a really interesting article in Science a few weeks ago about the idea of consciousness in other organisms. And my question is, not only is that the case, how far does it go? Does an amoeba have a consciousness? And to what degree would that be? And I think not only we're going to find the answer is yes, we're going to find that it's a much more complex one than the one we did. In fact, Julie was giving a talk at a Jeffersonian table talk during Design Week, that she talked about the fact that one of the things that's interesting is that we seem to kind of have this obsession with human intelligence. And it's because we're either, as she stated, too feeble-minded or too kind of like prejudiced against the idea of more complex consciousness beyond that of humans. Now, it reminds me of the fact that when I gave a lecture at the Museum of Natural History,
brilliant lecture.
thank you, I talked about the idea of potential architectures. And I remember there was this person who was a journalist, and he said to me, he said, like, are you going to be, it's like you kind of list here specifically human architecture. And he goes, what other architectures are there? I said, there's multiple, and kind of like, organic architectures from different organisms. And he goes, well, how would you rate them? And again, I'm kind of paraphrasing from a conversation a long time ago. How would you define those in relationship to humans? I said, I said humans are probably top 10, maybe top 5. And he goes, what? And I started listing a bunch of things that existed in terms of just kind of social insects that were far in advance of the things that we could do architecturally and engineering. And, the obvious one that came to mind was the fact that, like, a paper wasp nest, the nest weighs less than the wasps. And I thought, there's never been a structure that we ever invented that basically could sustain us that weighed less than the inhabitants. And I thought, that's still quite astonishing. So I was just reading this week that in certain fungal networks, the nucleus has multiple DNA signatures as opposed to that which we have within our own, meaning that our cells are always basically wedded, dependent to us, as opposed to kind of fungal ones that could potentially have a greater diversity and richness. Now, we talk all the time about diversity and richness, but we never really think about it in terms of the specifics of that within our own entity. Now, one of the things I love about, like I said, process and organic is the fact that an organic architecture is process-based, but also, as opposed to being homeostatic, it's homeoretic. And what I mean by that is a homeostatic thing basically is a stable circumstance. Now, organisms are very unlikely, as are processes, to constantly be stable. They're constantly shifting and changing. And though you might find stability at a certain point, that stability will be overturned by other components. And that doesn't mean that the other pieces don't exist. It means that they exist in some kind of trajectory. And that's kind of one of the brilliant aspects of the kind of nature of metaphysics that Whitehead instilled in process philosophy, in the fact that he basically understood that, just like Heraclitus and Leibniz, the idea of the changeability and the lack of a kind of static, kind of eternal substance was called into question. And I believe that's something that in the next couple of 100 years, as we kind of move through and better understand process and reality, we'll be able to come to kind of understand that. At this point, at 66 years old, I feel fairly comfortable with what I need to study to achieve what I want to do. And I just wish that instead of being 66, I was 26. But again, I still think that even if I was 26, there's more than a lifetime's work in this engagement. So in that sense, I mean, I have to go and, get to it. But anyway, as a result, these were the two circumstances that I talk about in terms of the work. Maybe what I'll do is kind of next week or the coming weeks, I'll start looking at certain things and explaining the aspects of what these things are specifically. But in that case, towards an organic architecture begins with this idea of creating meaningful analogies that can do both entangle and condition. And again, if I kind of like explain entanglement is that aspect where free things, free by meaning independent, basically come to become connected or contiguous or entangled, meaning that they basically take on a common pattern within their movement or their motions. So I remember seeing the fact that we talk about the fact in nature how energies and particles kind of come to and basically kind of like create a certain mass. We use the term critical mass, at which point something happens that couldn't have happened until it reaches this point, and then a new phase takes on. So again, that kind of sense of the homeoretic kind of trajectory kind of comes to be. So I kind of like figure that I've kind of come to make some of these analogous kind of models. And most of these things right now exist in terms of models, but they also kind of like exist in terms of diagrams. What I think is the next stage for my own drawing within this circumstance is be able to kind of like anticipate or kind of make some of these anticipatory conditionings to kind of like see a conditioning prior to, kind of making it. And I think that, again, the two things I feel also have a certain symbiotic relationship are drawings and models. I think that one of the things I've started to kind of become better at, though I'm not really as successful as I'd like, is being able to see how the models and the drawings can anticipate or kind of like entangle within themselves. So in that case, that's also kind of like part of the process of going on. What I've had to do, in fact, one of the things that's interesting was when I was in architectural school, even up until the time that I was kind of professor and then left in 1990, I had a conscious understanding of the things that I was making, and I was just kind of starting along this path. But one of the things that's interesting is I've had to retrain my thinking in order to kind of look at and understand and appreciate different things. What I mean by that is the fact that moving away from these kind of like artificially kind of parts mechanism type things and looking towards the kind of overlap and layering of the potential networks and processes. So that's part of the thing that's kind of become exciting. In fact, one of the things that was interesting was I have a really good friend who I've known for quite a while. And in fact, it was interesting. It kind of reintroduced me to the idea of being a critic or reviewer on architectural reviews. And she had met Julie through an entomologist friend of ours. And initially my feeling was like, nah, I don't know, I'm done with architectural education. I think it's moving in the wrong direction. But what was interesting was through this studio, which is a brilliant project, and I've interviewed Ahu on my channel. I should do it again when she comes back. She's just kind of gone back to Turkey for the summer. Was that I was on her last review, and she did this. Again, she's doing her studio. The students were much more capable of adapting to the circumstances beyond their comfort zone of what they believe the architectural generative process is than indeed were the critics, who were mostly other architects. So what was interesting was it was a great challenge to the architectural community. And in fact, what's interesting was I kind of could see, looking back across the situation, the gap that I had created between myself and others, because I felt incredibly comfortable in kind of conversing about these organic components and seeing these things as kind of symbiotic in terms of their relationship to us. Yeah, I definitely think when I have to do, let's see, I'm 32, unbreakable and outstanding. Yeah, I'm going to do one of kind of like critique of the hermet of a non-organic, a critique of a non-organic. Let me write that down. That'll be for number 33, which is the 13th of July. Critique of non-organic architecture or present critique of the present non-organic architecture. I already kind of have some ideas about that. Maybe that'd be a really good kind of thing, because I think it would allow us to kind of understand what the nature of the situation is. But I think that's a valuable thing. So again, those are the two things that I've set for myself, and I've been fairly successful in the fact that I've kind of enjoyed kind of seeing, by looking through beautiful monographs about microbiology and biology, and seeing these different pieces, and then kind of constructing and inventing these pieces. One of the things that I've kind of done is what I call ribbon structures. And ribbons, pretty much something we see a lot of places. We see ribbons in proteins. We see ribbons in microbes. We see ribbons in kind of like, multi-cell and simple single cell organisms. We kind of can. Yes, go P. P, get in here.
Model ribbon organisms, an entire organism is C. elegans. It's a kind of a flatworm, and it's a model organism for all sorts of biological experiments, and it is a ribbon.
Well, we have those, Puddle. We have, let's pull out some of our ribbon structures.
Okay.
It's like some of our kind of exotic kind of pieces.
The iPad yet, it's really low.
So actually what happens is we've actually kind of, in fact, what was interesting was, remember the time when we realized that we kind of create molecules, and in fact, on the piece over there, we actually made these as chains of independent pieces. Oh, the braid. Yeah, I love the braid.
Braided ribbon.
Yes.
Because it doesn't need to just be a solid ribbon.
Yeah, but what I also liked about this was that the open pieces kind of had the ability to kind of like be able to be. I actually going to make this into a tube, and then have the open pieces.
They feel like legs, and they feel like barnacle legs.
Yes, yes.
In fact, a barnacle.
Oh, here's a no. Oh, this is a love one. This is a great one. Ah.
And the legs stick
so there
out
was
the top of its
kind of like
head.
So there's another really.
That's a
good,
great.
Yeah, this one is a great one. But again, these were kind of made. Again, we have kind of like a cellular tube structure, and then we kind of have the independent things.
Like
and in fact,
cells.
yes, and in fact, this one I love is the fact that it actually can go around itself and connect to itself.
Kind of hook, and it doesn't need any glue. It doesn't need any tape.
Well, that was just it. In fact, one of the things was interesting. You remember, we started with the idea that we don't do any glue.
Yes.
Right. That everything you can laminate, just like anything in nature, you can laminate, but you can't do perpendicular connections.
Right.
And that was where you had to kind of start to include the forces. But here we kind of have, like we really kind of create
it's like a snowflake.
Yeah, but it also, what it does is it creates a homophobic organism, right? It's because it kind of creates an interior piece. But here it's a worm, right? And then the worm kind of with its cells. And then what happens is it basically contains the space. And then this piece kind of creates this homophobic bond. But again, these are the things that we've had in here.
Yes,
and I kind of like, we'll kind of create some of the models.
Yes, we have.
And then, I like this configuration with this one.
Oh yeah, that's very interesting.
Right. In fact, I found that this was again, it has the same. There we go. Oh, look.
Well, that's super interesting.
Yeah. But again, these are all just kind of ribbon structures.
And then you can stack it like this.
We could stack it. Yeah, we could make a tower. But again, the worms. Yeah, the worms, like you talked about the C. elegans.
Yeah.
I love the fact that
exactly
it is. But these things go from being flatworms, and again, there's usually some. I mean, we have a horizontal substrate. In fact, when we looked at the Broadacre City model yesterday, the Metropolitan Museum had some weird thing it was doing.
It was a VIP
event on a Friday night.
The entire
now they opened the Oceanic wing again, which was nice to see. And they spent 4 years basically making it look exactly like it was 4 or 5 years, making it look identical to what it was before they started.
Yeah.
Except for the fact that some of the placement of some of the objects makes them look kind of quite trinket-like or trite, which I thought was kind of. I thought it was somewhat unfortunate. Anyway, but in terms of that, the reality was we were kind of orphans for a day. So we went to MoMA and we got a chance to see the Broadacre City. And I really, we talked about the fact that Wright really saw the folds of the earth as the place for inhabitants, and that habitation was really taking place in terms of these kind of like folds and pleats and kind of elements that we found in the ground, which I think, again, I believe is very much a strong component of an organic architecture, and the fact that just like the place between the surface of the ground, which we see, unfortunately, wrongly as horizontal line, is actually a series of different layers and different densities and different components, and that somewhere in that situation, floating amongst that, is the house. Not this idea of this kind of hard horizontal line and the object sitting above it. I think that that's a kind of really kind of poor analogy, and I think that Wright was correct in terms of the fact that sitting the house somewhere into the earth, into the folds, into the pleats, was a much more reasonable approach. Um, that's something, again, I'll kind of talk about in the critique on July. So we'll see how that goes anyway. But I think that that's really something that needs to kind of be taken into account. I mean, I think in order for our houses to grow, they need to kind of be sustained in some kind of substrate, some kind of like, operative, generative, organic substrate, and itself to be that way. Julie came up with an idea of kind of like the diving bell spider in terms of a pressurized component that's kind of forced into the ground and then basically allows you to kind of open it at the bottom to allow the injection of the kind of natural elements, but pressurized so it never can basically overwhelm the thing itself, which is a cool idea. Anyway, so that's kind of coming up as a separate thing. But for now, I'm really excited about the potentials for the investigations I have in front of me in terms of the things that I see.
Look, I took a really great photo.
Oh, perfect. That's better. Can we see that better?
I don't
Let me see.
know. I'm not really sure.
Oh, that's better.
Well,
it's still, and now it's glass against glass.
Now it's
against
glass
glass.
again. I think it was
Yeah,
better with the
okay.
paper, but yeah.
All right. So that this has been a fun one. I kind of hit most of the things I was thinking about, but I kind of think one of the things that was good was, seeing myself across, looking back towards architecture and kind of seeing the gap, but kind of not sensing the kind of the rift or kind of like isolation. I feel very happy with the place that I'm at, and I think the investigation is at least certainly something that for the rest of my life will certainly kind of take up my time. I feel fairly well grounded in what I need to do and where I have to go. But I also feel as if for the first time, I may have a better understanding of the things that make for this to be consequential. Yeah, hopefully.
Wait, I had a quick thing to discuss that you're the perfect person to talk about is individual adaptation of universal building materials. If you think about it, these body parts of the spider's prey are to the bone collector caterpillar universal building materials. There are a series of prey that generally are in these spider webs. And think of it, generation after generation, maybe for thousands of years, of the bone collector caterpillars have been doing this. So you don't think that maybe there is a genetic memory and a social learning process that's passed in? How do they know?
I think they know. I think it's something that I like, again, just the same way that certain things exist as analogs and homologs over the course of time and evolution. I believe it's something that's there in general. In fact, one of the things that was interesting when Nigar was here and we spoke about her project at ICFF, I saw this as more of a kind of the potential, talking about your piece, for a potential exoskeleton, in the fact that we have much more capability in terms of mobility, much more capability in terms of our kind of like ability to kind of keep ourselves self-sufficient. Anyway, we're almost coming up and we can't break the 1 hour barrier.
No,
so
I quite agree.
All right. So the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to the benefit of us all to maintain this. Thank you.
I really hope that taped. It didn't